Okay, welcome to Did Syd Barrett, Atom Heart Mother. And in this episode, I'd like to break down the album Atom Heart Mother, and in particular, three songs, which are really the only three songs with established lyrics, which are If, Summer of 68, and Fat Old Sun. Pretty good songs, and there's a lot of material to them, so I don't want to waste too much time. But let's go ahead and jump into the episode. So normally what I do is I will run through corrections from previous episodes, and unfortunately, because of the way I do this, which is I just kind of write down basic points, I totally forgot to do the introduction for the Led Zeppelin 4, Did Syd Barrett Led Zeppelin 4 episode, and that's important, of course, because the lead-in to Stairway to Heaven was intended to be a discussion of the lyrics within Astronomy Domine. Now, if you look at Astronomy Domine, Mr. Barrett is talking about planets, he's talking about Shakespeare, and he's also talking about mythology or social influences, depending upon how you want to read that. And he gives the line, Stairway Scare Dan Dare. Now, the stairway, in relation to the context of the planetary bodies or the heavens, could be taken as an early kind of an early form, perhaps, of the title Stairway to Heaven. There is also, of course, the William Blake painting, a very wonderful painting of what looks to be a stairway to the heavens. And, of course, in the Bible, there's Jacob's Ladder. So, who knows if all that's going on? I'm just kind of pointing out that there's a kind of relations there of some kind. That's really the only correction that I wanted to make. So, let's go ahead then. And before we get into the album songs, I want to discuss a few things. And that really is the history of what was happening with the band just before this album came out. Now, of course, in early 68 was when Mr. Barrett left or was kicked out of the band, depending upon how you want to view things, or perhaps was just moved to a new role of writer or assistant, distant writer, or perhaps eventually removed. That has never been totally made clear exactly what happened when, in my opinion. So the band, of course, had made Saucerful of Secrets, and they also made an album, Ummagumma, and I haven't really jumped into Ummagumma, and I'm not going to. And the reason is because that's kind of a weird album. I don't really like that album. I do like the song Grantchester Meadows, which has been, of course, accredited to Roger Waters, and we've already discussed Grantchester Meadows in a previous episode. That song really is the most important song. Of course, Astronomy Domine is on there, but we've discussed that before. Interesting, isn't it, to you that they would reuse that song? They also have Careful with That Axe Eugene, which is, I don't know. I suppose the most interesting bit of that song is that Roger Waters has an interesting screaming voice. He can make very interesting sounds as a scream. Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which is a song that they have been working on for quite some time. Saucerful of Secrets redone, and then the Several Species of Small Furry Animals, which again is just kind of a groove, not a whole lot going on with that song. And then, to me anyway, as far as the most interesting song musically, as far as a purely musical song, The Narrow Way, parts 1 through 3, which is attributed to Mr. Gilmore, and I find that to be musically the most rewarding of the songs off of the album. Now there's also a Sisyphus, which is attributed to Rick Wright, and then Grand Vizier's Garden Party, which is attributed to Nick Mason. So everybody kind of put in their own to that album, but honestly, I don't think it's a very good album, personally. I can't really listen to it. Perhaps it's a good album if you like going to sleep. Not to be mean, but I did used to go to sleep to Pink Floyd quite often. Now, the cover art is interesting because I believe that it was helped to be put together by Storm Thurgerson of Hypnosis, and he's one of the people to put together that group of art designers that eventually went on to design quite a few Pink Floyd album covers. And, of course, one of the most famous ones was the one for Dark Side of the Moon. So I don't know really, I'll kind of call that out. Yeah, apparently Storm Thurgerson was involved, so I just read that here. I'm kind of looking through things. So there's a bit of changes of people. It's almost like a fractal It's a repeat view of the same kind of a scene, and of course in a mirror, which has been referenced prior to this, you can see that people are changing positions, and you have to kind of wonder if that's on purpose, if that's supposed to relay some kind of a meaning. I don't know that it does, but it certainly does give the impression, perhaps, that people are not necessarily where you think they are or doing what you think they're doing. Kind of interesting if you're interested in Mr. Syd Barrett. That would seem to perhaps be something that might pique your interest, let's say. So let's go ahead then, and that was released in November of '69, and eventually, of course, they did release More, which is a soundtrack for a movie, and I'd just like to point out that the band made, I guess you could say, 4 soundtracks. So there's the More soundtrack, there is the Valley or Obscured by Clouds soundtrack, which I believe was made later on in the 70s, the early 70s, and then there was, unknown to me until recently anyway, they were involved in the development due to there's some odd stories about this, who somebody apparently had obligated them to work on this film, Zabriskie Point. Now, Zabriskie Point, I don't know if they ever did use any of the songs that Pink Floyd had made for them, but it's quite an interesting film. It's a film that did have Harrison Ford in it. I think the Doors wrote some music for that album, and so did Jerry Garcia. You can go ahead and look up that movie. It's kind of a cult, I don't know what you call that, kind of an important movie to the underground, let's call it that. And it is meant to be a subculture movie. Of course, that's why Jerry Garcia would be involved. And I don't think most Americans have seen that movie. I know I haven't. So it wasn't very well received, apparently, at the time. Maybe at some point in time I'll go watch it. And eventually, then, of course, that's the 3 soundtracks that they did put together that were early, and then later on, of course, they would do The Wall, which was not just a soundtrack, but was actually the entirety of it, was a film and the music put together. So that right there is kind of an indicator, anyway, in my opinion, that the band was very interested in film. And even though they're a band that's, I think most people would recognize as one of the great rock bands of all time, I don't think people realize that they did have their hands quite a bit in the film, and at least were paying attention to film, unless they were just taking whatever job they could get to pay the bills, which is definitely possible. So let's go ahead then, and I want to move on to our actual album, Atom Heart Mother. Now, this was released in October of 1970, and I guess I'll just kind of point out where Mr. Barrett was at that time as well. So, of course, Mr. Barrett had released Madcap Laughs, and that album was released in, I believe, early 1970. So, not too far before, in January of 1970. Now, it was about a 2-year recording period for Madcap Laughs, and then later in 1970, of course, Pink Floyd released this album, Atom Heart Mother, and I'll come back to why that may be important later on. So let's go ahead and take a look at the actual songs of Atom Heart Mother and the title of it, and we'll try to discuss some things about the album. Now, the first thing is, I really don't know what Atom Heart Mother means, the title itself. It's a little bit odd, but I can definitely draw a kind of a connection to Mr. Barrett, obviously, because there's the term mother right there again. And, of course, he did Matilda Mother, and I don't know, he seems to have kind of a family relations kind of a vibe, and depending on whether or not you think he had a hand in a song like Seesaw, then you can draw connections there as well. So let's look. The first side of the album is basically all instrumentals. There are some people singing, but it's just vocals, wordless vocals. So There's A Father's Shout, which is an interesting title, of course, as we already discussed in the Peeling Syd Barrett Effervescing Elephant. The next part of it is called Breast Milky. I have no idea what's up with that. And then Mother 4, I have no idea. But again, there's the Mother title. Funky Dung, I don't know. Mind Your Throats, Please, I don't know. And then Re-Emergence. Now, normally you would think Re-Emergence or coming out again, but it says Re-Emergence, which seems to be a made-up word that specifically indicates that a coming together or coming together again. And that makes me think, of course, of chapter 24 and the seeming intent of that song to eventually come back together with Pink Floyd over time. And if you're interested in that theory, you can watch Peeling Syd Barrett chapter 24. So let's go ahead then, and I'm not going to go into Alan's psychedelic breakfast. I don't know what to make of that. But let's go ahead then and look at the side 2 songs, If, Summer of 68, and Fat Old Sun. I'm going to discuss them, and I'm going to score them as we go. So if you would, pull up the lyrics for If, and we'll discuss that. Okay, so first we have mentioned that if they were a swan, then they'd be gone. A very simple rhyme. Nothing too interesting there. I mentioned about a train, so I'm going to give a point there because, of course, Mr. Barrett did do the train kind of artwork for, I think it was See Emily Play that he did that artwork for. There's a mention about if they were good, man, then they would talk more than they do. And, of course, reticence to talk or being a bit of a social outcast is something that Mr. Barrett constantly talked about, so that's another point. There's a mention about sleeping and dreaming, so to me that's 2 points, sleeping and dreaming. I mentioned that if they were afraid they could hide, and that is a repeat actually of the idea that's kind of put forward in Julia Dream. And we did Syd Barrett Julia Dream. You can check out the lyrics there, but basically the lyric goes something along the lines of the scaly armadillo, find me where I'm hiding. So, of course, I'm not going to give a point for that because that song is attributed to Roger Waters. If you believe that it was written by Syd Barrett, then here's another connection to Syd Barrett. But officially, Julia Dream was attributed to Pink Floyd and Roger Waters as writers, not Syd Barrett. Okay, there's a mention here of going insane and then a fear of having wires put in the brain. So there's an insanity response there, or a concern about going insane. That seems to be a Syd Barrett connection, so I'll put a point there. There's a mention of the moon being cool. I'll give a point for the moon because Mr. Barrett has repeatedly referenced the room. Mention that the rules should be bent and not following rules, I suppose. And the mention of not understanding the spaces between friends, which is, of course, another form of social anxiety or social misfit. I'll give that another point. We're at 7 points now. I mentioned of being alone and crying. I'll give that 2 points, both for being loneliness and the crying reference. And there's a bit about being with you and being dry. Don't totally know what that means, but I'll let it go. Another reference to going insane, but I'm not going to score that again because it's a repeat. But the next bit is important. Will you let me join in the game? And the game is, of course, a beat poet reference. The game in general refers to life in society. So asking someone if they would let him back into the game of life, I suppose. Or perhaps just the relation. And the next is just a repeat. So I end up with a score of 10 on If, which is pretty much mid-range for where we've seen on scores so far. I don't think I'm going to show all the scores all the time. The cumulative scores. I'm just going to say that when we have a score that's around 4, I believe was Paintbox, versus 20 to 22, which is a very high correlation. Something that's in the low double digits, like 10, is kind of mid-range for us. Okay, let's look at the next song, Summer of 68, which is attributed to Rick Wright, I believe. And it's a wonderful song. A lot of people really enjoy this song. It has kind of an upbeat feel to it, but when we get into the lyrics, I think you'll agree it's not necessarily a very upbeat song. So let's run through it real quick. Summer of 68. Now I'm going to give it a point already to start with because Mr. Barrett had already been referencing the winter of 67. So here's almost like a follow-up possibility to the winter of 67. So it starts off asking a question, would you like to say something? And then you're going to have to leave or before you leave. And saying perhaps or maybe you'd like to state exactly how you feel. Now this is very wordy. If you compare the wordiness of this, and I would say that the simplicity of the previous song is in line with what you would expect from Roger Waters. He has a tendency to simply state things. So you could subtract a point if you want, but I'm not going to. I will point out that these first two lines rhyme, leave and feel, but they're inverted. So the leave or leaf is the same phonetic sound as feel inverted. I'm going to give a point for that. That is an indicator of someone who's rhyming through phonetics, as we've discussed Mr. Barrett has a tendency to do. There's a statement about saying goodbye before they even said hello, that they don't even really like someone and they shouldn't even care. And they only met 6 hours ago and the music was loud. And then from their bed, they gained a day and lost a year. Okay, so this is very complicated. I'm going to come back to this because we need to understand it in context. And hopefully this can be clarified. And the reason for that is obviously that there is a time discrepancy here. The statement that they just met 6 hours ago, but they've lost a year. It doesn't make sense logically. So let's keep going and see if we can come back to it and make sense. And I think you'll agree that it kind of does. Okay, so there are quite a few things I could score there, but I'm going to come back to this. So hopefully I can say, I'll do those scores when we come back. So then is the chorus, I'd like to know, how do you feel, how do you feel, how do you feel, so on. Not being able to determine how somebody feels to me is an indicator somewhat of someone who does not have social skills or an ability really to communicate well, so I'm going to give a point for that. Okay, so let's get to the next verse. There's a thing saying that there wasn't a single word said. There's another one, so I'll give another point for that. An ability to communicate. There's a bit about the night hiding their fears. Very similar, again, feel to Julia Dream, but again, Julia Dream is attributed to Roger Waters. So I will not score a point for that. There's a mention of occasionally showing a smile, and then feeling the cold too soon in a room of 95. I have no idea what that could possibly mean. My friends are in the sun. I wish I was there. Okay, this is attributed to Rick Wright, and I'm going to ask you a very simple question. What friends are in the sun? Now, in the sun, lying in the sun, of course, is a reference to saying that the sun is shining on people, or in other words, they're having a great life. So why is Rick Wright saying that his friends are having a great life and he wishes he could be there too? That is an extreme possibility of Syd association because, of course, he was out on his own and he wasn't with his friends anymore. Friends, of course, we're assuming would be the rest of the band. I'm going to give that 2 points, so we're at 6 total now. Tomorrow brings another town and another girl, I suppose, and have you time to go before you greet another man. Okay, so I just want to point out a few things now, and that we can see now that this is kind of a sneering, almost like a sarcasm, overly enthusiastic, what's the word I'm looking for here? Where you just kind of obsequiously try to adhere to social norms, but it is all done in sarcasm. And in fact, the question they're asking, do you have time to leave before you greet another man? In other words, before you're with another person. The greet reference there is implied familiarity with, or perhaps even intercourse with another man. So this is a very accusatory song, and in fact it has a feel to it that is a bit like One of My Turns off of the Wall album, I'll point out. I believe that's the name of the song, One of My Turns. So let's go back then to the beginning, and I'm going to review this, and we're going to check out for signs of overly elaborate politeness, or polity, I believe is the word. So perhaps you'd care to state how you feel with a sarcastic tone. Say goodbye before we say hello. So, how could we have met just 6 hours ago and from their bed lost a year? Well, I will point out, of course, that this could mean that this relationship has gone on for a year and a day. So this could almost be something happening on an anniversary, on a 1 year anniversary. They're having a form of an argument. There's not a whole lot of rhyme going on here or alliteration, but it does have a very interesting flow to it. So at any rate, I don't know that the guys were kind of going through this kind of unstable relationships. I know that Mr. Barrett was. I'm going to give a point for that. I believe Rick Wright was married for quite some time. I know Roger Waters was married early on, and he eventually, I believe, divorced and remarried. So I'm going to give a point, and currently I'm at 7 total. So the music being too loud, of course, could be a reference to, if we were to draw a Syd kind of comparison, I'll just point out that Pink Floyd remained kind of a rock band, and Mr. Barrett and his solo music was going back to more simple, quiet songs. So the idea that the music was too loud could, of course, be a reference to the music before that he was playing, which was considered to be loud to him. And now he's doing more kind of folk, just simple guitar music. So I'll give a point. We're at 8. Okay. I'm not going to... the bit about bringing another town and another girl like you, I don't know. It's a little bit misogynistic. The whole tone of this is misogynistic. I'm going to give a point for that. So we're at 9. And then the last bit is goodbye to you. And then it says Charlotte Pringles do. I don't know necessarily what that means. And then I've had enough for one day. What all that means, I don't know. But I will point out that Charlotte Pringles would perhaps be a nickname, which we've noted Mr. Barrett has a tendency to do. That'll give me a score of 10 again. And I believe there are some kind of rumors or urban kind of legends about who Charlotte Pringles could be. Perhaps it's a reference to a person, or perhaps it's just a abbreviation, a CP. You take the first 2 letters and it applies to somebody in particular. I'll let you decide that. I won't go into it too much more. So let's move on then to Fat Old Son, which is actually my favorite song off of this album. And this is attributed to, I believe, David Gilmour. And it does have a feel that's very similar to Grantchester Meadows, I'll just kind of point out. So let's look through it real quick. Fat Old Son, so I'm going to give it a point right there. There's already a mention of the sun, so that's 1 point. Mention that the fat old sun in the sky is falling. Yeah. Summer, evening birds are calling. And I suppose. Now there's a mention of summer's thunder and that time of year. Okay. So I'm going to give a point for that. And the reason is, of course, because there was just a song of thunder that we reviewed in Slang, in which the thunder and lightning were very important to the development of the character Swan Lee. So that's a reference which is consistent with that. And Silas Lang, or Swan Lee, was a song that Mr. Barrett was developing very early on in his independence from the band. Summer, Sunday, and a year. Okay, that's very interesting right there. There's a day and a year, which is the same time frame that we just referenced in the previous song. So that's a year and a day. I'm going to give that another point, and the reason for that is because these are supposedly 2 totally different writers making songs. Why are they both referencing the same period of time, exactly a year and a day? I don't know. Okay, let's keep going. There's music in their ears, distant bells, and the new mown grass smelling sweet. By a river holding hands. There's a river mention. I'll give a point for that. And then the next one, roll me up and lay down. So I'm going to give a point for that, and the reason is that There was a song called Roll Me Another One, I believe, that Mr. Barrett put together, and eventually they rewrote it into Candy and a Currant Bun, I believe. But I think the original title of that was Roll Me Another One. So I'll give a point for that. We're at 5. That could be a reference, I don't know. There's a mention about if you see, then don't make a sound. Well, there's a sound and a ground, which we've heard before, sound, ground, all around, which was in Astronomy Domine, I believe. And picking your feet up, Mr. Barrett has had a tendency to mention heaviness of feet. I'll give a point for that. A mention of hearing as the warm night falls. Silver sound of a time strange. Now, of course, the strange word, Doctor Strange, was referenced in one of the songs from the More album, which we called out, but it's just a word strange, not Doctor Strange here, so I won't really count that. Now, the silver sound, of course, is similar in concept to the silver of the Scarlet Eagle, which is called out in I think it was Matilda Mother. So I'm going to give a point for that. We're at 8. And a silver sound and a tongue so strange. So, of course, the tongue reference also was used in a feathery tongue and singing to me. The feathery tongue reference is in Dark Globe by Mr. Barrett, so I'll add a point for that. Keep going. It kind of repeats with some variation. So, children's laughter is in his ears, and sunlight that disappears. So, there's a reference to sunlight. I guess I'll give a point for that. And something about if you see, then don't make a sound. So, being able to see things, of course, is something Mr. Barrett constantly refers to. I can see you, you can't see me, etc., etc. One more point, so I'm at 11. And that's it, I guess. I end up with an 11 score on Fat Old Son. So, interesting correlations, I would say, to Mr. Barrett's lyrics here in this album. And I will also point out that Mr. Gilmore and Mr. Waters are kind of on record. You can read about this on Wikipedia. I'll kind of throw it in there. I have heard an interview, if I can find it, I'll throw it at you, where Mr. Waters kind of says that Atom Heart Mother was kind of a waste of an album. They don't really like it. Odd thing to say about something that you made, right? I mean, and it could, of course, just be that they don't think it's worth playing. I understand that. But I also want to point out that it is possible, of course, that for most artists, they don't really dislike things they made. There are things that they made that they say, perhaps I learned how not to do things there with that. Maybe that's what they're saying. But also, I mean, something has to be pretty bad for me to say that I completely regret doing it and that it was kind of a waste of time. Just my opinion. Okay, so let's go ahead then and move on. And what I'd like to discuss now is the actual cover design, which I think a lot of people realize is a bit odd, but they don't really try to break it down. They just kind of look at it and say, well, that's a little bit weird, so what could that possibly represent? Or what might be going on there? Now, I'm going to start this off by discussing Storm Thurgeson with Hypnosis. He was kind of the creative mind behind that group, supposedly. And there are a number of things that I kind of want to point out about him. First off is, of course, he was part of the development of quite a few covers for Pink Floyd, and that started with Ummagumma. And we've kind of discussed to some degree the nature of the almost deliberate variability of the people and their positioning in that photo for that fractal style image of reflection within a reflection within a reflection, which implies some things to some people, I'm sure, but the easiest reading would simply be that, you know, people are interchangeable or they're not where you think they might be. An interesting visual effect, perhaps, or perhaps it's relaying something else. At any rate, for this particular cover, there are some kind of questions that I think a lot of people would have. One is, why a cow? I mean, it's kind of strange. It's a bit boring. It's very plain, and does kind of draw your eye to it and pull you into the album because it's just so simple and odd. Now, within Wikipedia, Mr. Ferguson kind of relays the idea that they were looking for something that was fairly simple, so he went out to the countryside to do some shots, and apparently one of the possible influences for this, or the idea behind it, is Andy Warhol and his cow wallpaper. So I'll kind of show an image there of a cow wallpaper, and you have to wonder, of course, who's paying attention to Andy Warhol. Well, I think quite a few people in the art world were paying attention to Andy Warhol, of course, but we do have reasons to think that Mr. Barrett may have been, of course, paying attention to Mr. Warhol quite a bit. And I have kind of mentioned the Velvet Underground as a possible connection to Andy Warhol and Mr. Barrett, and I'll kind of mention that again here, and I'll get into that a little bit more later on. So my basic question is, of course, did Mr. Storm Thurgeson come up with this on his own? Did he approve it on his own, or did the band kind of approve what the image would be? Did someone else approve what the image would be? And did somebody else put the idea of a cow in his head before he went out? Because he kind of mentions wanting to achieve a look of something like that, but he doesn't say who had the inspiration to actually come up with this cow idea. That's the first bit. Okay, so the second thing that I kind of want to break down is, I suppose, the nature of what a cow could represent. Now, of course, symbolically, a cow can represent many things, and beyond just basic symbolism, and we've dealt with that before, there also are religious and slang connotations for cows. So the religious connotation, of course, would go through many religions. I'll point out the idea of the golden cow or the golden calf statue that's in the Bible. There also was a painter named Franz Marc, who's a wonderful German expressionist painter who had a very famous painting of a yellow cow, and he associated the color yellow with femininity. And again, there's kind of the idea of a golden cow, but we mentioned before Picasso's kind of connection between the bull and male virility, male fertility. I can't remember if we mentioned somebody else or not, but definitely Picasso. And I think Goya as well might have had some kind of something going on with that. But I do know that Picasso had the two main things that we've discussed already with minotaurs. So Mr. Franz Marc, who put together quite a few wonderful, very, I guess you could say, Van Gogh-inspired style paintings with deliberate symbolism within them, is kind of pointing to the idea of I guess you could say, the power of the innately female. So is that kind of what's being relayed in this cover, this idea of, the power of the female? From a religious perspective, of course, there's also the idea of the importance of cattle in the Hindu faith. And we do know that Mr. Barrett was involved in yoga, and also was influenced, as we've mentioned previously, with a number of Eastern religions. So perhaps he was if he did actually influence this in some way, then perhaps that is being carried over. Now, I would like to point out that the cow is kind of looking to the side and appears to be walking away from us. So perhaps there's a distance that's happening there. Perhaps we are walking back away from the cow, or perhaps the cow is leaving us, and there's kind of a look or an exchange of understanding that there's a relationship that's being broken of some kind. I don't know. You can decide that on your own. And that is, of course, assuming that maybe Mr. Barrett might have had something to do with the actual development of that cover. Now, the last thing that I kind of want to point out is a possibility of something being kind of mean or cruel. And we do know, of course, that Mr. Barrett had a number of relationships that went bad, and he seems to be someone that has quite an ability for bad relationships for some reason. And I don't pick up on that with the other guys in Pink Floyd. They seem to be quite stable. And I believe they all had stable relationships through the early 70s, through the late 60s, early 70s. I don't know that for a fact, but I do believe that was the case. So what I would like to do then is, using my Dictionary of American Slang, we've noted that Mr. Barrett likes to use slang. What can a cow represent? Definition 5, slang, any fat or ungraceful person. And colloquial, a girl of any size or shape. So, is it possible that this cow is being presented on the cover as a form of a joke? And is that perhaps supposed to be making fun of someone that is being placed deliberately on the cover? Now, why would I make that connection? Well, because on the Madcap Laughs album, there is a lady that is kind of within the album that's part of Mick Rock's photo shoots, and she is playing kind of a prominent background role in that photo shoot. And I will also point out that there is a band called The Soft Machine that has a cover for Volume 1, which is also showing a lady in the buff from behind. So note here that the cow is being shown from behind, looking forward. That is a pose for this lady on Volume 1 of The Soft Machine. I don't think I'm going to show it because, well, I might show a little bit of it, but I won't be able to show the whole thing because it has nudity in it, I suppose. And I will point out that that is reminiscent of some of the poses of a certain lady that was taking pictures of by Mick Rock for the Madcap Laughs album, and who happened to be there with Syd when they were doing the photo shoot. Now, those shots are very famous to fans of Pink Floyd because of the blue and orange flooring of Mr. Barrett's flat that he had painted, but also because of the lady in the background who's posing in the nude, and some of those photos made it into the album itself. Now, that is reminiscent to me of a few paintings from the Romantic period, and I will just kind of point those out to you now. There is a very well-known painting by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres called Grand Odalisque, and that is from 1814. And you can see there's a lady that's kind of reclining. She's apparently supposed to be part of a harem, thus the headband and the feather fan, and the kind of romantic, idyllic setting. And this kind of setting of a reclining nude figure was very popular for the Romantic era, and goes back to painters like Giorgione and Titian. So, and I would also like to point out that in our Peeling Syd Barrett discussion of Arnold Layne, we also mentioned the movie Intolerance, which discussed the same thing, or the same setting, of a harem. Now, there also is another quite famous painting by Eugene Delacroix, The Death of Sardanapalus, which also portrays a harem setting, and that's from 1826. And I'll try to give a vision of that here as well. So that setting and that kind of pose of a woman or a lady in the buff, and with a reclining kind of setting, was quite popular for the Romance era, and that I will just point out is somewhat reminiscent of the cow that's kind of being looked at from behind. And of course, the cow is already in the buff because it's just a cow. And if someone perhaps was mad at someone or was being cruel, then perhaps they might have taken that out or been referencing that as a kind of a joke, a mean joke, or perhaps even, I don't know, just throwing it in there just out of spite and for some reason. So the last thing that I'd like to run through really quick is a few ideas that are covered by Mick Rock in his book, Mick Rock, Photos of Syd Barrett by Genesis. Now I do recommend this book if you like photography and if you're into Mr. Barrett and Pink Floyd. I personally like both of the photos, and I do also like the write-ups by Dougie Fields and by Mick Rock. They have quite a few personal stories that they run through here. It's by Genesis Publications Limited, and copyright on the one I have is 2001 for the photos, 71 for the interviews, and I don't know about the book itself. I suppose that's applicable for the book itself. So there are a few things that I just kind of, I suppose I would like to just kind of point out in here that maybe pertinent to the discussion that we were just having. Now, the first one is on page 23. Mr. Mick Rock, in an interview, or at least in his own writing, specifically says that Syd could be a little bit cruel to women. We've noted the misogynistic tone in some of Mr. Barrett's songs and lyrics, and here that is confirmed directly by Mr. Mick Rock. On page 57 is an interview with Dougie Fields, and he specifically says that he knew that Syd liked the Velvet Underground. And the Velvet Underground is, of course, a New York band that was tied to Andy Warhol. So there's that information. Previously, we mentioned who the lorry driver could be, and the lorry driver on page 81 is Dougie Fields is having an interview, and he mentioned that for a while Dave Gilmour was a delivery driver for Quorum. So that kind of may explain the lorry driver statement in Apples and Oranges. Depends on how you read that lyric. I'm the lorry driver man, or I'm her lorry driver man. On page 87, Dougie mentions that there was a girlfriend, an American. I suppose I'm going to just go ahead and say that there was an American girlfriend. I won't say the name here. But on page 87, there's a reference to Mr. Dougie Fields having a relationship with this girl, apparently, and then eventually Mr. Barrett did as well, an American. And I will just point out the idea that, of course, Mr. Barrett did take a trip to the United States, and that does somewhat tie in perhaps with the idea of going to California with an aching in their heart, which is from the Going to California song by Led Zeppelin, which we discuss in Did Syd Barrett Led Zeppelin 4. Okay, on page 99, Mick Rock relays that Syd was quite, the word he uses is changeable, so that he would be talking very normally, and then someone would come into the room that perhaps Mr. Barrett didn't like or didn't trust, and he would completely change his demeanor. Now, of course, we've discussed some aspects of what we do and don't know about things. I just want to point out that if someone is able to completely control the way that they're interacting with other people, to me, that indicates a level of mental control that you wouldn't expect from someone who's struggling with things. On page 106 is a story about by Mick Rock about Syd locking himself in rooms and not wanting to talk with people. And on page 109, Mr. Barrett, this is an important one. Mick Rock relays the idea that that quite specifically, Mr. Barrett says that the last time that he was in love, it was only for a few months, and at the end of it, he almost had a complete breakdown. So, or almost broke down. So, there, from the mouth of someone who apparently people are saying is struggling with just general problems, is saying or admitting, at any rate, if you believe the interview, that they almost had a breakdown, but it wasn't related to anything other than a relationship, or at least the stress or whatever that was tied to that relationship. So again, there's more proof perhaps of other things impacting Mr. Barrett than what other people might be saying in these kind of mass-produced pop videos about him being an overdose drug addict or being an acid casualty or just a maniac. That seems quite clear there in that quote that and that's from the mouth of Mr. Barrett as it's relayed by Mick Rock, that what he is pointing to as a significant stressor in his life is actually a relationship. Okay, and the last thing that I would like to point out, at least regarding the cover here, is that we do have a song where he mentions being on all fours and cleaning or something like that, and that is, of course, Scream Thy Last Scream, and something about you'll be on all your fours scrumping or something like that. That lyric, well, let me see if I can get my lyric book here, if I can find it. Got books laying all over the place. At any rate, I'll try and put up portions of that, and of course, that will, I think, kind of be an indicator that the idea, at least, of someone being on all fours and either doing work or scrounging around or scrubbing floors or whatever he alludes to in his song is perhaps yet another indicator that he is making a possible animalistic metaphor to the standard wife position in a classical relationship or a conservative relationship. Perhaps he's making fun of that, or I don't know exactly what. But if you believe that Mr. Barrett had something to do with the cover design, then there's some more kind of, I would say, ammo for your argument. So that's pretty much it. I guess that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll talk to you later.